The ancient stones of Rome whisper their secrets across the millennia, carrying stories of power and ambition, wisdom and madness, through the warm Mediterranean air that still drifts over the Seven Hills. In the golden light of a Roman dawn, when shadows stretch long across the Forum's weathered marble, and the Tiber flows silently past the city's ancient foundations, one can almost hear the echoes of a transformation that would reshape the known world. The cobblestones remember the footsteps of senators in their white togas, the clanking of legionnaire sandals, and the measured pace of a young man who would become the first to bear the title that would outlast empires and define the very concept of supreme authority. The Republic had grown old and weary, its institutions straining under the weight of an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt. For centuries, Rome had been governed by the delicate balance of consuls and senators, of checks and balances that had served well when Rome was merely a collection of hills beside a winding river. But as the legions marched ever outward, conquering Gaul and subduing the proud kingdoms of the East, the old ways began to creak and groan like ancient timbers in a storm. The machinery of republican government, designed for a city-state, found itself attempting to govern a world. And the strain showed in every heated debate in the Senate House, every clash between ambitious generals who had tasted the intoxicating wine of absolute command in distant provinces. Into this world of fading traditions and mounting tensions stepped Gaius Octavius, a slender youth whose quiet demeanor masked an intelligence as sharp as a Damascus blade and an ambition as vast as the empire he would one day rule. Born into the dying years of the Republic, when the very air seemed heavy with the promise of change, he carried within his veins the blood of Julia, sister to Julius Caesar, that towering figure whose shadow fell across the Roman world like a colossus. The boy who would become Augustus learned early the lessons that the marble halls of power could teach: that strength without wisdom was mere brutality, that fear without respect was temporary dominion, and that the art of ruling lay not in commanding obedience, but in making subjects wish to be ruled. The transition from the chaos of civil wars to the ordered majesty of imperial rule unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, each movement calculated and precise. Where others had seized power through the crude instrument of military might alone, Augustus understood that true authority flowed from the consent of the governed, from the Senate's grudging acknowledgement, and from the people's genuine affection. The young emperor wrapped his revolutionary changes in the comfortable garments of tradition, speaking always of restoration rather than innovation, of returning to the ancient virtues rather than embracing radical new forms. His genius lay in this subtle deception, or perhaps this profound truth, that the most lasting changes often come disguised as conservation, that the future frequently arrives wearing the mask of the past. The consolidation of power under Augustus proceeded with the patience of a master architect, laying foundations that would endure for centuries. Rather than sweeping away the institutions of the Republic in a single dramatic gesture, he allowed them to continue their ancient functions while quietly assuming their essential powers. The Senate still met in its hallowed chamber, still debated with the passionate intensity that had characterized Roman politics for generations, but now their debates moved within boundaries established by the princeps, the first citizen who was somehow both servant and master of the state. The consulship continued, that highest office of the Republic, but now it was an honor bestowed by imperial favor rather than a prize won through the fierce competition of equals. This masterful balancing act required not just political acumen, but a deep understanding of the Roman character itself. Augustus recognized that Romans were a practical people who valued results above theoretical purity, who would accept even dramatic changes if they brought peace, prosperity, and order to a world that had known too much chaos. The emperor's building programs transformed Rome from a city of brick into a metropolis of marble, creating employment for the masses while simultaneously demonstrating the stability and permanence of his reign. The Praetorian Guard provided security not just for the emperor's person, but for the very concept of stable government, their disciplined ranks a visible reminder that the days of civil war had ended, and that a new era of peace had begun. The provinces, those far-flung territories that had strained the Republic's administrative capabilities beyond the breaking point, found themselves transformed under Augustus's steady hand into well-governed parts of a coherent whole. Where Republican governors had often viewed their assignments as opportunities for personal enrichment, imperial legates now served as extensions of the emperor's will, their actions guided by consistent policies rather than individual greed or ambition. Roads stretched across continents, carrying not just the trade that enriched the empire, but the ideas and institutions that bound diverse peoples into a single Roman world. The postal system carried imperial edicts with unprecedented speed and reliability, ensuring that the emperor's commands reached the furthest corners of his domains, while also bringing news of distant provinces back to the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. Augustus understood that power, like water, must flow through established channels to be useful rather than destructive. The imperial bureaucracy he created was neither the heavy-handed tyranny that some had feared, nor the weak compromise that others had expected, but something entirely new, a system of government that combined efficiency with legitimacy, strength with restraint. Tax collection became regular and predictable, rather than the arbitrary extraction that had characterized the late Republic's desperate attempts to fund its military adventures. Justice flowed more consistently through imperial courts that answered to a single ultimate authority, rather than the competing jurisdictions and personal vendettas that had made Roman law uncertain and unpredictable. The emperor's personal conduct provided the model for this new form of governance. Augustus lived with a simplicity that bordered on austerity, dwelling in a house that, while comfortable, would not have seemed ostentatious to a successful merchant. His clothing was woven by his wife and daughters, rather than purchased from the luxury workshops that served the truly wealthy. His meals were simple, his entertainments modest by the standards of the Roman elite. This deliberate restraint served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that imperial power need not corrupt. It provided a stark contrast to the excesses of the late Republic's politicians, and it established a standard of behavior that future emperors would be measured against. The transformation Augustus achieved was so complete and so skillfully executed that within a generation, Romans could hardly remember a time when there had not been an emperor. The institutions of the Republic continued to exist, their ancient ceremonies preserved, and their traditional honors maintained, but they had been so thoroughly integrated into the imperial system that their independence had become merely ceremonial. The emperor's presence was felt everywhere, yet seemed to intrude nowhere, a paradox that spoke to the sophistication of Augustus's political genius. Power flowed from the Palatine Hill through channels so natural and established that they seemed to have existed since Rome's founding, though in truth they represented one of history's most successful political innovations. The foundation stones of imperial rule, laid with such care during these crucial early years, would support the weight of empire for centuries to come. Augustus had solved the fundamental problem that had destroyed the Republic: how to govern a world-spanning empire without sacrificing either effectiveness or legitimacy. His solution was characteristically Roman in its practicality, and characteristically his own in its subtlety. Create new realities while preserving old forms, concentrate power while maintaining the illusion of distribution, rule absolutely while appearing to serve. The empire he created would endure through the reigns of the wise and the mad alike. A testament to the strength of institutions founded not in a moment of revolutionary passion, but through the patient work of a master craftsman who understood that the greatest monuments are built to last not just for years, but for ages. The golden age that Augustus had so carefully constructed would not endure beyond his bloodline's ability to maintain the delicate balance between absolute power and reasoned governance. As the first emperor's successors took hold of the purple, the very foundations he had laid began to crack under the weight of unchecked authority and the corrosive effects of limitless indulgence. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, born from Augustus's political genius, would become a cautionary tale of how quickly wisdom can give way to madness when power flows through veins unprepared to carry such a burden. Tiberius, Augustus's reluctant heir, had ruled with the measured caution of a man who understood the precarious nature of imperial authority. His reign, though marked by increasing paranoia in its later years, maintained the structural integrity that Augustus had established. The Senate still functioned, the provinces remained stable, and the Roman people continued to prosper under the Pax Romana. Yet beneath this surface calm, the seeds of future chaos were already taking root in the imperial household, where young princes grew up, surrounded by the intoxicating vapors of absolute power without the tempering influence of republican ideals. When Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended to the throne in 37 CE, the Roman world initially rejoiced. Known affectionately as Caligula for the small military boots he had worn as a child in the German camps, he was the son of the beloved general Germanicus and represented hope for a return to the military glory that had made Rome great. The young emperor's early months seemed to fulfill these expectations, as he restored popular assemblies, recalled political exiles, and distributed generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the people of Rome. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill echoed with optimism, and senators who had chafed under Tiberius's increasingly suspicious rule breathed easier in what appeared to be a new golden dawn. But power, when concentrated in a single individual without the checks and balances that had characterized the old republic, has a way of revealing the deepest flaws in human nature. Whether through illness, inherited mental instability, or simply the corruption that comes from never hearing the word no, Caligula began to transform into something that defied the very notion of civilized leadership. The transformation was gradual at first, manifesting in eccentric pronouncements and bizarre ceremonial innovations that amused more than they alarmed. He declared his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul, and built a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, simply to ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, demonstrating a grandiosity that seemed almost charming in its theatrical excess. Yet these early eccentricities were merely the overture to a symphony of madness that would consume the empire for nearly 4 years. Caligula began to demand worship as a living god, ordering statues of himself erected in temples throughout the provinces and insisting that citizens offer prayers and sacrifices to his divine person. The ancient Roman respect for the gods and traditions became twisted into a cult of imperial personality that reduced senators to groveling sycophants and transformed state ceremonies into grotesque displays of megalomania. The emperor appeared in public dressed as various deities, sometimes as Jupiter with thunderbolt in hand, other times as Diana or Venus, his painted face and elaborate costumes creating a surreal spectacle that left witnesses uncertain whether they were attending a religious ceremony or a theatrical performance gone mad. The financial profligacy that accompanied these divine delusions drained the imperial treasury with breathtaking speed. Caligula spent vast sums on public games, building projects, and personal luxuries, transforming the careful fiscal management that Augustus had established into a spendthrift's paradise. Golden statues and jeweled decorations adorned every surface of the imperial palace, while elaborate floating bridges and temporary amphitheaters consumed resources that had once been dedicated to maintaining the empire's infrastructure. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed constantly from the Palatine, as artisans worked around the clock to satisfy their emperor's increasingly fantastical architectural visions. The political murder that ended Caligula's reign in 41 CE brought temporary relief, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Praetorian Guard, having discovered their power to make and unmake emperors, elevated Claudius to the throne in a chaotic transition that demonstrated how completely the old constitutional order had collapsed. Though Claudius proved to be a competent administrator and accomplished military commander, his reign was overshadowed by palace intrigue and the growing influence of freedmen and wives who manipulated imperial policy from behind silk curtains and marble columns. When Claudius died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned by his ambitious wife Agrippina, the throne passed to her 16-year-old son Nero. Initially guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, the young emperor's early years showed promise of rational governance and cultural flourishing. The great teacher's influence could be seen in imperial policies that emphasized clemency and philosophical reflection. While the capital experienced a renaissance of artistic and literary creativity that seemed to herald a new Augustan age. But adolescent power, especially power without limits, has its own terrible momentum. As Nero matured physically while remaining emotionally stunted by the hothouse atmosphere of imperial court life, his natural inclinations toward theatrical performance and artistic expression began to overwhelm his responsibilities as ruler. The young emperor's passion for chariot racing, lyre playing, and dramatic recitation gradually consumed more and more of his attention, transforming state governance into a secondary concern behind his artistic ambitions. Palace walls that had once echoed with debates over policy now reverberated with the emperor's singing practice and the applause of courtiers who had no choice but to appreciate his performances. The descent into genuine tyranny accelerated when Nero began to eliminate anyone who might constrain his absolute freedom. His mother Agrippina, who had orchestrated his rise to power, became the first victim of his paranoid suspicions when she attempted to maintain influence over imperial policy. The matricide that followed shocked even a Roman society accustomed to political violence, as the emperor's agents pursued Agrippina across the Bay of Naples in an elaborate assassination plot that involved a collapsing boat and, when that failed, a more conventional stabbing in her villa. With Agrippina's death, the last vestige of restraint disappeared from Nero's character. The emperor's artistic pretensions took on increasingly grandiose dimensions as he performed publicly in the theatre, scandalizing traditional Romans who believed such displays beneath the dignity of their ruler. His voice, trained by the best musicians gold could buy, filled amphitheatres across the empire as he competed in singing contests that no one dared allow him to lose. The sight of their emperor, crowned with laurels and dressed in colourful costumes, prancing across stages, while citizens were required to sit through hours of imperial entertainment, created a spectacle that reduced Roman gravitas to absurdist theatre. The great fire that consumed much of Rome in 64 CE provided Nero with both crisis and opportunity. While the emperor's response to the disaster showed moments of competent leadership, organizing relief efforts and opening his own palace to refugees, rumors spread that he had started the blaze to clear land for his architectural fantasies. Whether or not these accusations held truth, Nero's subsequent construction of the Golden House, a vast palace complex that sprawled across the city's heart, confirmed the popular perception that their emperor valued personal magnificence above the welfare of his subjects. The building's rotating dining rooms, artificial lakes, and mile-long covered walkways created a private paradise that existed in stark contrast to the charred ruins where ordinary Romans struggled to rebuild their lives. The conspiracies that eventually brought down Nero in 68 CE emerged not from popular uprising, but from the exhaustion of the governing class, senators and generals who could no longer maintain the pretense that the empire was being ruled rather than merely entertained. The last Julio-Claudian emperor's death marked the end of Augustus's bloodline and opened a period of civil war that would demonstrate how completely the constitutional foundations of Roman government had eroded under the weight of unlimited imperial power. The death of Nero in 68 AD sent tremors through the very foundations of the Roman Empire, leaving behind a void where imperial authority had once stood unquestioned. The mad emperor's final words, lamenting what a great artist perished with him, echoed hollowly through the corridors of power as ambitious men throughout the provinces began to sense opportunity in the chaos that followed. The carefully constructed dynasty of Augustus lay in ruins, its bloodline extinguished, its legacy tarnished by decades of excess and brutality that had transformed the Principate from enlightened rule into a theatre of horrors. In the provinces, where Roman eagles cast their shadows across distant lands, legions loyal to their commanders, rather than to any distant throne, began to stir with anticipation. The delicate balance that had held the empire together through force of tradition and the mystique of imperial blood now wavered like candlelight in a gathering storm. Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, emerged from his provincial stronghold with the stern bearing of an old republican, his weathered face carved by decades of military service and administrative duty. His march toward Rome carried with it the promise of restoration, the hope that discipline and frugality might cleanse the imperial palace of its accumulated sins. The aged emperor's entry into the Eternal City bore none of the triumphant pageantry that had marked earlier imperial processions. Instead, Galba's austere presence seemed to cast a pall over the marble forums and gilded temples, his severe reforms striking fear into the hearts of those who had grown comfortable under the previous regime's largesse. The Praetorian Guard, those supposed protectors of imperial majesty, watched with calculating eyes as their new master's parsimony threatened their accustomed privileges. Gold that had once flowed freely from the imperial treasury now remained locked away, while promises of bonuses and rewards died unspoken on the emperor's thin lips. Winter's grip tightened around Rome as whispers of discontent spread through the military camps scattered around the city's perimeter. Otho, a senator whose ambitious heart burned with the memory of his former wife's theft by Nero, saw in Galba's unpopularity the seeds of his own elevation. His conspiracy unfolded in the shadows of the Palatine Hill, where senators and soldiers alike gathered in secret chambers to plot the overthrow of the miserly emperor who had promised so much, yet delivered so little. The Ides of January brought with it a savage conclusion to Galba's brief reign, his blood seeping into the stones of the Forum, where he fell beneath the swords of his own guardsmen. Otho's triumph proved as ephemeral as morning mist upon the Tiber's waters. Far to the north, along the Rhine's muddy banks where German tribes pressed against Roman fortifications, another claimant to the purple had already begun his inexorable march southward. Vitellius, corpulent and indulgent, commanded the loyalty of battle-hardened legions who had grown wealthy from their conquests in Gaul and Germania. His soldiers sang of victory and plunder as they crossed the Alps, their hobnailed sandals ringing against the ancient stones of mountain passes that had witnessed the passage of countless armies throughout the centuries. The collision between these rival forces came at Bedriacum, where spring flowers bloomed incongruously among the implements of war. The battle unfolded beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the clash of shields and the screams of dying men creating a symphony of destruction that echoed across the Lombard plains. Otho's forces, despite their determination, could not withstand the disciplined fury of the Germanic legions, and as news of the defeat reached the emperor's ears, he chose the path of honor over continued civil strife. His suicide, performed with the calm dignity of a Roman noble, brought his reign to an end after merely 3 months of increasingly desperate rule. Vitellius entered Rome like a conquering barbarian king, his enormous appetite extending far beyond the pleasures of the table to encompass the very wealth of the empire itself. The new emperor's feasts became legendary exercises in excess, where exotic delicacies from the furthest corners of the known world disappeared down his gullet, while Rome's treasury emptied to fund his insatiable desires. His court became a carnival of sycophants and gluttons, where senators prostrated themselves before a ruler whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to consume vast quantities of peacock tongues and flamingo brains. Yet, even as Vitellius revelled in his newfound power, events in distant Judea were already shaping the empire's future. Vespasian, a general of humble birth, who had earned his reputation through solid competence rather than aristocratic breeding, commanded the Roman forces, attempting to crush the Jewish rebellion that had erupted 3 years earlier. His methodical campaign against the fortified cities of Palestine demonstrated the kind of patient, practical leadership that had once made Rome great, while his soldiers learned to respect a commander who shared their hardships and understood their needs. The proclamation of Vespasian as emperor came not from the Senate House or the Praetorian camp, but from the legions of the East, where Roman eagles looked out over the ancient kingdoms of Asia. The news spread like wildfire through the garrison towns of Syria and Egypt, where veterans of countless campaigns recognized in the Flavian general the qualities of leadership that had been so conspicuously absent from recent rulers. Alexandria's great harbour echoed with the cheers of legionaries as they swore their oaths to a man who promised not glory or wealth, but competent governance and the restoration of Roman dignity. The final act of this year-long drama unfolded as autumn leaves drifted through Rome's streets, like omens of change. Vitellius, his earlier confidence crumbling before the steady advance of Flavian forces, attempted to abdicate in favor of his rival, but the momentum of events had already carried the situation beyond the reach of peaceful resolution. The Second Battle of Bedriacum saw the last gasps of Vitellian resistance crushed beneath the disciplined advance of Eastern legions, their standards glinting in the weak sunlight of a dying season. Rome itself became the final battlefield as Flavian forces stormed through the city's gates in December's bitter cold. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, ancient seat of Roman religious authority, burst into flames during the fighting, its destruction seeming to symbolize the end of one age and the violent birth of another. Vitellius met his end in the narrow streets below the Palatine, his corpse dragged through the mud by soldiers who had no patience for the niceties of imperial dignity. From this crucible of civil war emerged Vespasian, a man whose very ordinariness seemed revolutionary after decades of imperial madness and excess. His broad peasant features bore none of the aristocratic refinement that had marked his predecessors, while his practical approach to governance reflected the values of Italy's rural heartland rather than the sophisticated decadence of the capital. The new emperor's first acts demonstrated a pragmatism that bordered on the revolutionary as he opened the imperial court to men of talent, regardless of their birth, while beginning the careful work of restoring the empire's shattered finances. The Colosseum began to rise from the grounds where Nero's golden palace had once sprawled, its massive stones laid by workers whose wages came from the methodical liquidation of the previous regime's excesses. This great amphitheatre would stand as a monument to Flavian practicality, providing the Roman people with the spectacles they craved, while demonstrating that magnificence need not require the bankruptcy of the state. Vespasian's famous jest about money having no odour reflected a worldview that valued results over pretensions, substance over style. Under Flavian rule, the empire began to heal from the wounds inflicted by a generation of imperial madness. Roads were repaired, frontiers were strengthened, and the machinery of government resumed its steady function after years of neglect and abuse. The dynasty that emerged from the chaos of civil war would prove that Rome's greatest strength lay not in the divine pretensions of its rulers, but in the solid competence of practical men who understood that true power came from service rather than self-indulgence. The tumultuous winds that had shaken Rome during the year of 4 emperors gradually settled into a different kind of rhythm, one that would echo through the marble corridors of power for nearly a century to come. Where the Flavian dynasty had brought stability through military pragmatism and administrative efficiency, the emperors who followed would elevate Roman governance to heights of philosophical contemplation and benevolent wisdom that historians would later regard as the empire's most luminous period. The transition from the practical Flavians to what posterity would celebrate as the 5 good emperors represented not merely a change in ruling families, but a fundamental transformation in how imperial power might be conceived and wielded. Never, the first of these remarkable rulers, ascended to the purple in 96 CE as an elderly senator whose very appearance embodied the dignified restraint that would characterize this golden age. His lined face, marked by decades of careful observation in the Senate, reflected a lifetime spent studying the delicate mechanisms of power rather than wielding them through force. When the Praetorian Guard assassinated Domitian, the last of the Flavians, they found in Nerva not a general hungry for conquest, but a thoughtful administrator who understood that true strength lay in earning loyalty rather than commanding fear. His brief reign of less than 2 years established precedents that would resonate through the reigns of his successors, most notably the radical notion that an emperor should choose his heir not from among his blood relatives, but from among the most capable men the empire could offer. The wisdom of this adoptive principle revealed itself magnificently in Nerva's selection of Trajan, a Spanish-born general whose bronze complexion and weathered hands spoke of campaigns along distant frontiers rather than comfortable afternoons in Roman gardens. Trajan brought to the throne a fascinating combination of military excellence and administrative sophistication, expanding the empire to its greatest territorial extent, while simultaneously deepening its internal harmony. Under his rule, the great column that still bears his name rose in the heart of Rome, its spiraling marble reliefs capturing not merely the drama of conquest, but the methodical organization and engineering prowess that made such victories possible. The carved figures ascending the column's surface seemed to move in eternal procession, their stone faces bearing expressions of determined competence rather than savage triumph. The golden light that filtered through the clerestory windows of Trajan's market, that magnificent complex of shops and administrative offices, illuminated more than mere commercial transactions. Here, beneath soaring brick arches that anticipated architectural innovations still centuries in the future, the practical philosophy of good governance took tangible form. The careful regulation of grain distribution, the standardization of weights and measures, the establishment of alimentary programs to feed orphan children throughout Italy. These initiatives reflected a ruler who understood that lasting greatness emerged not from the thunder of cavalry charges, but from the quiet satisfaction of citizens who trusted their government to serve their fundamental needs. When Trajan died in distant Cilicia, his ashes, returning to Rome in a golden urn that caught the Mediterranean sunlight like captured flame, the empire passed to Hadrian, a man whose restless intellect and artistic sensibilities would redefine the very notion of imperial leadership. Hadrian possessed the unusual combination of a soldier's practical experience and a philosopher's contemplative nature, spending much of his 21-year reign traveling throughout his vast domains, studying local customs, examining architectural details, and engaging in lengthy conversations with provincial administrators about the subtle art of maintaining order across diverse populations. His villa at Tivoli, with its ingenious interplay of pools, porticos, and carefully orchestrated views, became a three-dimensional manifestation of his governing philosophy, complex, harmonious, and endlessly surprising in its thoughtful details. The Great Wall that Hadrian constructed across northern Britain stood as more than a military fortification. It represented a fundamental shift in Roman strategic thinking from endless expansion toward thoughtful consolidation. The massive stones, fitted together with mathematical precision and extending across 84 miles of challenging terrain, created not merely a barrier against barbarian incursions, but a statement about the empire's maturation into a civilization confident enough in its achievements to define clear boundaries. Along its length, Roman soldiers from across the Mediterranean world stood guard, their varied accents and customs gradually blending into a unique frontier culture that embodied the empire's capacity to transform diversity into strength. Hadrian's death marked the beginning of perhaps the most philosophically sophisticated reign in Roman history, as Antoninus Pius assumed power with the grave dignity of a man who had spent decades contemplating the proper relationship between authority and responsibility. His cognomen, Pius, reflected not religious devotion in the narrow sense, but rather a deep commitment to duty and propriety that manifested itself in 23 years of peaceful, methodical governance. Contemporary observers noted how Antoninus seemed to age gracefully rather than under the crushing weight of imperial responsibility, his silver hair and increasingly lined face bearing witness to careful deliberation rather than anxious worry. The empire during his reign resembled a vast, well-tended garden, where problems were addressed before they could flower into crises, and where the ordinary business of civilization proceeded with reassuring regularity. The philosophical current running through these reigns reached its fullest expression in the person of Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations would preserve for posterity the inner thoughts of a man struggling to apply Stoic principles to the practical challenges of governing millions of people across 3 continents. Written during long campaigns along the Danube frontier, these reflections reveal an emperor who viewed his position not as an opportunity for self-aggrandizement, but as a demanding spiritual discipline requiring constant self-examination and moral courage. His weathered campaign tent, lit by flickering oil lamps during the long northern evenings, became an unlikely philosophical laboratory where abstract principles of virtue and duty were tested against the concrete realities of military necessity and political compromise. Marcus Aurelius possessed the distinctive ability to find profound meaning in the routine administrative decisions that filled an emperor's days. The appointment of provincial governors, the arbitration of commercial disputes, the careful balancing of competing interests among different social classes and ethnic groups. His correspondence with legal scholars and provincial administrators revealed a mind that approached each decision as an opportunity to advance the cause of justice and rational governance, treating even the most mundane bureaucratic matters as components of a larger moral enterprise. The bronze equestrian statue that portrayed him in the Forum, right hand extended in a gesture of beneficent authority, captured this essential quality of leadership exercised as philosophical practice rather than mere political ambition. The final member of this extraordinary succession, Lucius Verus, served as co-emperor alongside Marcus Aurelius, embodying the innovative notion that the empire had grown too complex for effective management by a single individual. Their partnership, unique in Roman history, demonstrated how personal friendship and shared philosophical commitments could overcome the natural tendency toward rivalry and suspicion that had destroyed so many previous arrangements for shared power. When Lucius Verus died during the Parthian campaign, Marcus Aurelius's private grief found expression in meditations on mortality and the transient nature of human achievement, reflections that deepened rather than diminished his commitment to conscientious governance during his remaining years as sole emperor. The physical transformation of Rome during this golden century reflected the philosophical evolution of imperial leadership, as public buildings increasingly emphasized harmony, proportion, and accessibility rather than overwhelming grandeur designed to intimidate subjects into submission. The Pantheon, completed during Hadrian's reign, exemplified this architectural philosophy with its perfect geometrical relationships and its revolutionary dome that seemed to float weightlessly above visitors, creating a sense of contemplative wonder rather than oppressive awe. Light entering through the great oculus moved across the marble surfaces throughout the day, like a gentle reminder of the cosmic order within which human civilization found its proper place. This remarkable period in Roman history established enduring precedents about the proper relationship between power and wisdom, demonstrating that effective governance required not merely administrative competence or military skill, but the deeper philosophical understanding that true authority derived from service to the common good rather than personal ambition. The legacy of the 5 good emperors would resonate through subsequent centuries, providing a standard of excellence against which later rulers would be measured, and inspiring political theorists to envision forms of government based on merit and moral character, rather than hereditary privilege or brute force. As the philosophical reign of Marcus Aurelius drew to its twilight in the year 180, the Roman Empire stood at the pinnacle of its civilized achievement. A vast tapestry of ordered provinces, stretching from the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria. The Stoic emperor had spent his final years contemplating the nature of duty and mortality, while defending the northern frontiers against barbarian incursions, his meditations filled with reflections on the impermanence of earthly power and the weight of imperial responsibility. Yet, even as he penned these profound thoughts on the transient nature of human ambition, Marcus Aurelius made a decision that would shatter the very foundations of the Antonine peace. He chose to pass the purple to his biological son, rather than adopt a worthy successor, as had been the custom of the 5 good emperors. Commodus entered the world of imperial power like a storm cloud gathering on a clear horizon, his very presence marking the end of an era that had known unprecedented prosperity and philosophical governance. Born to privilege in the year 161, he had grown to manhood surrounded by the luxuries of the Palatine Hill, watching gladiatorial games from the imperial box while his father campaigned along distant frontiers. Where Marcus Aurelius had sought wisdom in the teachings of Epictetus and the harsh realities of military command, his son found inspiration in the bloodied sands of the amphitheatre and the adulation of crowds who cheered for spectacle rather than substance. The contrast between father and son seemed to embody the eternal tension between duty and desire, between the philosopher's contemplation of virtue and the hedonist's pursuit of immediate gratification. The transformation of imperial character became apparent almost immediately upon Commodus assuming sole power, as the measured cadence of Stoic governance gave way to something far more primal and disturbing. The new emperor's fascination with gladiatorial combat extended far beyond mere spectatorship. He began to see himself as a divine warrior, a modern Hercules destined to perform great deeds in the arena rather than the council chamber. The marble halls of the imperial palace, once filled with the quiet discussions of philosophers and administrators, now echoed with the clash of weapons as Commodus practiced his sword work, often against opponents who had been instructed to lose or face execution for their victories. This was no longer the measured world of Marcus Aurelius, where power was wielded reluctantly and with constant self-examination, but rather a realm where imperial whim took precedence over imperial wisdom. The Senate, that ancient body which had weathered the storms of Caligula and Nero, watched with growing alarm as Commodus began to systematically dismantle the careful balance that had characterized the Antonine period. Senators, who had grown accustomed to being consulted on matters of policy, now found themselves relegated to ceremonial roles. Their advice neither sought nor welcomed by an emperor who increasingly viewed himself as accountable only to the gods. The delicate relationship between emperor and senate, carefully cultivated by Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, deteriorated into barely concealed hostility as Commodus surrounded himself with freedmen and gladiators whose loyalty could be bought with gold and whose silence could be ensured through fear. The emperor's paranoia grew like a cancer, fed by the whispers of informants and the schemes of courtiers who understood that in this new climate, survival depended not on virtue or competence, but on the ability to flatter and manipulate an increasingly unstable ruler. As the years passed, the megalomania that had initially manifested as mere theatrical excess began to metastasize into something far more dangerous and destructive. Commodus declared himself the reincarnation of Hercules, commissioning countless statues that depicted him in the lion's skin of the legendary hero, his face bearing the serene confidence of divinity rather than the weathered features of mortality. The imperial apartments were transformed into shrines to his own magnificence, filled with golden representations of his supposed divine form, and tended by priests whose primary qualification was their willingness to worship a living god. This was not the carefully managed imperial cult that had served previous emperors as a tool of political unity, but rather the fevered dream of a man who had lost all connection to the boundaries between human ambition and divine prerogative. The arena became the stage for increasingly elaborate displays of imperial prowess, each performance more shocking than the last to audiences who had thought themselves inured to spectacle. Commodus would appear before the crowds, dressed as a gladiator, his golden armor gleaming in the afternoon sun as he dispatched opponents with theatrical flourishes that owed more to choreography than genuine combat. The emperor's victories were never in doubt, for his opponents were typically wounded animals, disabled slaves, or criminals armed with wooden weapons, yet the crowds were expected to cheer with genuine enthusiasm for these hollow triumphs. The very notion that the ruler of the civilized world would debase himself by appearing as an entertainer was anathema to Roman tradition. Yet none dared voice such criticism openly, for the emperor's agents moved through the stands like silent shadows, noting which faces showed insufficient enthusiasm for the imperial performance. The cruel whims that had initially been confined to the controlled environment of the arena began to spill over into the broader governance of the empire, poisoning the administrative machinery that had functioned so smoothly under the previous Antonine rulers. Provincial governors found their carefully crafted reports ignored in favor of gladiatorial schedules, while military commanders discovered that promotions and honors were now distributed based on the emperor's momentary fancies rather than demonstrated competence in the field. The great public works projects that had characterized the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian gave way to increasingly grandiose monuments to Commodus himself. Vast expenditures of public funds channeled into celebrations of imperial ego rather than improvements to infrastructure or military defenses. The empire's coffers, once carefully managed by administrators who understood the delicate balance between revenue and expenditure, were plundered to fund ever more elaborate games and ever more lavish displays of imperial magnificence. The psychological deterioration of the emperor manifested itself in increasingly erratic behavior that kept the court in a constant state of nervous tension, never knowing which word or gesture might trigger an explosion of imperial rage. Commodus would order the execution of senators for imagined slights, then lavish expensive gifts on gladiators who had pleased him with their performances. His mood swinging between grandiose generosity and homicidal paranoia with no apparent pattern or logic. The imperial secretaries, once powerful figures who helped shape policy throughout the empire, now found themselves reduced to the role of frightened servants, tasked primarily with ensuring that their masters' increasingly bizarre commands were carried out without question or delay. The emperor's inner circle became a collection of sycophants and opportunists, men who had learned to read the subtle signs of imperial mood and adjust their behavior accordingly, their survival depending on their ability to anticipate and feed the emperor's delusions of grandeur. The broader Roman populace, initially entertained by their emperor's theatrical performances, gradually began to understand that they were witnessing not merely eccentricity, but genuine madness. The bread and circuses that had traditionally served to maintain public order took on a darker character as the games became increasingly sadistic and the emperor's participation increasingly central to the proceedings. Citizens who had once looked to the imperial box with pride now averted their eyes, uncomfortable with the spectacle of their ruler's degradation, yet powerless to voice their disapproval in any meaningful way. The very foundations of Roman society, built on concepts of dignitas and gravitas, that emphasized the importance of maintaining proper behavior and respect for tradition, were being systematically undermined by an emperor who seemed to take perverse pleasure in violating every norm and expectation. Military discipline, that bedrock upon which Roman power ultimately rested, began to show signs of strain as news of the emperor's behavior spread throughout the legions stationed along distant frontiers. Soldiers who had sworn oaths of loyalty to Rome itself found themselves questioning the worthiness of their current commander-in-chief, while barbarian tribes beyond the borders began to sense weakness in the empire's leadership and probe for opportunities to test Roman resolve. The careful balance of intimidation and diplomacy that had maintained the Pax Romana for nearly 2 centuries started to wobble as foreign peoples realized that Rome was now led by a man more interested in gladiatorial glory than military strategy, more concerned with theatrical triumph than territorial defense. As the 12th year of Commodus's reign drew to a close, the empire that Marcus Aurelius had left behind, prosperous, well-administered, and secure, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A realm where fear had replaced respect, where arbitrary cruelty had replaced measured justice, and where the philosophical ideals that had guided the Antonine dynasty had been abandoned in favor of megalomaniacal self-worship. The Golden Age was ending, not with the dignity of natural succession, but with the grotesque spectacle of imperial madness, setting the stage for the chaos and instability that would follow in its wake. The death of Commodus in the final hours of 192 CE marked not merely the end of a reign, but the collapse of an entire world order that had brought stability to the Mediterranean for nearly 2 centuries. As dawn broke over the 7 hills of Rome on the first day of 193, the city awakened to find itself adrift in uncharted waters. The great ship of state suddenly without a captain, its compass spinning wildly as competing forces seized the helm. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who had once been the emperor's most trusted protectors, now revealed themselves as kingmakers of the most mercenary sort. auctioning the purple to the highest bidder in scenes that would have been unthinkable during the golden age of the Antonines. Pertinax, the elderly senator who briefly grasped the imperial diadem, lasted merely 87 days before the same guards who had elevated him struck him down in the palace corridors, his blood pooling on marble floors that had once echoed with the measured footsteps of Marcus Aurelius. The empire that had seemed as permanent as the stones of the Pantheon now trembled like a house built upon sand, as rival claimants emerged from distant provinces like wolves scenting weakness in the capital. Septimius Severus, the iron-willed African who ultimately claimed victory in this first contest of arms, understood that the old order had died with Commodus, and that only strength, naked, uncompromising, and ever vigilant, could hold together an empire that had grown too vast and too complex for the gentle guidance of philosopher kings. The Severan dynasty that followed represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of imperial power, as the elegant fiction of the Principate, that careful balance between republican tradition and monarchical reality crafted by Augustus, gave way to something more honest in its brutality. Septimius Severus spoke plainly to his sons as he lay dying in York, far from the Mediterranean warmth of his African homeland, advising them to enrich the soldiers, despise all others, and stick together. His words, preserved in the amber of historical record, reveal the stark calculus that would define the centuries to come, where imperial survival depended not upon the approval of the Senate or the love of the people, but upon the loyalty of legions stationed along frontiers thousands of miles from Rome. Under Severus and his successors, the empire became increasingly militarized, its resources flowing like tributaries toward the great river of military expenditure that sustained the legions guarding the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern provinces, where Parthian horsemen prowled beyond the horizon. The cities that had once been jewels of Roman civilization, Antioch with its colonnaded streets, Alexandria with its great library, Athens with its philosophical schools, now groaned under the weight of taxation demanded by an imperial government that had transformed itself into a vast military machine. The delicate economic ecosystem that had flourished under the Pax Romana began to show signs of strain, as silver became scarce and emperors debased their currency to pay soldiers whose loyalty was as fickle as morning mist. The assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 CE marked the beginning of what historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century, though such a clinical term scarcely captures the chaos that engulfed the Roman world for the next 50 years. Like a great tree struck by lightning, the empire seemed to split along hidden fault lines that no one had recognized during the golden centuries of expansion and prosperity. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern frontiers with unprecedented ferocity, their own migrations driven by mysterious pressures from the vast steppes of Asia, while Persian armies under the Sassanid dynasty swept across Mesopotamia and Syria like desert storms, capturing Roman cities and carrying off their populations into distant captivity. In this crucible of crisis, a new breed of emperor emerged, men who had risen from the ranks of common soldiers to command legions through sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance. Maximinus Thrax, the Thracian giant who never set foot in Rome during his 3-year reign, ruled the empire from military camps along the Danube, his massive frame draped in the purple as he led cavalry charges against Gothic raiders. These soldier emperors bore little resemblance to the cultured aristocrats who had once governed from marble palaces in the capital. They were products of the frontier, men who understood that imperial power now flowed from the point of a sword rather than from the deliberations of the Senate House. The empire fractured like ice under pressure as regional strongmen carved out their own domains, claiming imperial titles that carried authority only as far as their legions could march. In Gaul, a succession of usurpers established what historians would call the Gallic Empire, minting coins that bore their own stern faces, while Roman forces remained locked in combat along distant frontiers. The wealthy trading cities of Palmyra in the Syrian desert threw off Roman rule entirely, their warrior queen Zenobia leading armoured horsemen across the sands to conquer Egypt and much of Asia Minor, before the resurgent forces of Aurelian finally brought her golden ambitions to an end. Through this half-century of upheaval, the very concept of what it meant to be emperor underwent a profound transformation that would echo through all the centuries that followed. No longer could an emperor afford to present himself as the first citizen among equals, as Augustus had done, or as a philosopher king dispensing wisdom from his study, as Marcus Aurelius had attempted. The new imperial style was unabashedly military, with emperors appearing on coins clad in armor rather than togas, their faces bearing the hard lines of men who had looked death in the eye on countless battlefields and had somehow survived to tell the tale. The economic foundations of the empire, already strained by constant warfare and military expenditure, began to crumble as silver mines played out and trade routes became unsafe for merchants who had once moved freely from Britain to the Euphrates. Inflation ravaged the currency as emperors minted coins with ever-decreasing amounts of precious metal, their portraits becoming crude and barbaric as skilled craftsmen fled the chaos or were pressed into military service. Cities that had boasted populations in the hundreds of thousands dwindled as their inhabitants fled to the countryside, seeking safety behind the walls of fortified villas, whose owners had transformed themselves from peaceful landowners into local warlords capable of defending their domains against bandits and barbarians alike. Yet even in this darkest hour, when it seemed that the great edifice of Roman civilization might collapse entirely under the weight of its own contradictions, certain emperors emerged who possessed both the military prowess to survive and the vision to begin the long process of reconstruction. Claudius Gothicus earned his cognomen by defeating the Gothic tribes in a series of brilliant campaigns, while Aurelian the Restorer lived up to his title by reuniting the fractured empire through a combination of diplomatic cunning and relentless warfare that brought the breakaway regions back into the imperial fold. These military emperors, forged in the furnace of perpetual conflict, understood instinctively that the empire they sought to preserve was no longer the same entity that had emerged from Augustus's settlement centuries earlier. The old republican institutions had withered away like autumn leaves, replaced by a bureaucratic machinery designed solely to extract resources and manpower for the military campaigns that had become the empire's primary reason for existence. The transformation was as complete as it was irreversible, marking the end of one chapter in Roman history and the beginning of another that would eventually culminate in the revolution initiated by Diocletian, who would finally stabilize the empire by acknowledging formally what had already become true in practice, that Rome was now an absolute monarchy whose ruler governed not through consensus, but through the divine authority of office and the sharp edge of military might that enforced his will across 3 continents and countless peoples who still called themselves Romans, despite living in a world that their ancestors would scarcely have recognized. From the blood-soaked battlefields and crumbling frontiers of the 3rd century crisis, where emperors rose and fell like wheat before the scythe, emerged a figure whose vision would reshape the very foundations of Roman governance. Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, born to humble origins in the windswept province of Dalmatia, possessed the rare combination of military acumen and administrative genius that the empire desperately required. His ascent to power in 284 CE marked not merely another change of imperial guard, but the beginning of a profound transformation that would echo through the centuries. Diocletian gazed across the vast expanse of Roman territory with the calculating eye of an architect surveying a structure on the verge of collapse. The empire stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Syria, from the Rhine's cold waters to the cataracts of the Nile. Yet, this immense domain had become ungovernable for a single ruler. The emperor understood that the traditional model of imperial governance, rooted in the fiction of the Principate established by Augustus 3 centuries earlier, could no longer contain the centrifugal forces threatening to tear Rome asunder. In response, he conceived a revolutionary system that would divide power while preserving unity, creating what historians would later term the Tetrarchy. The great innovation unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance across the Roman world. Diocletian retained the eastern territories for himself, while appointing Maximian as Augustus of the West, each emperor governing vast territories with the authority of a supreme ruler. Below them served two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, who administered smaller but crucial regions while preparing for eventual succession to the rank of Augustus. This division of power created a system of checks and balances that prevented the concentration of authority in a single pair of hands, while ensuring that capable leaders governed each quarter of the empire. The four rulers established their capitals in strategic locations: Nicomedia in the east, Milan in northern Italy, Sirmium on the Danube, and Trier near the Rhine, creating a network of administrative centers that brought imperial authority closer to the frontiers. The emperor's reforms penetrated every aspect of Roman life, with the methodical precision of a master craftsman reshaping his tools. The military underwent systematic reorganization, with the traditional legions supplemented by smaller, more mobile units called limitanae, who guarded the frontiers, while a central reserve of comitatenses stood ready to respond to major threats. Provincial administration received similar attention, as Diocletian divided the unwieldy provinces into smaller, more manageable units, creating a hierarchy of governors, vicars, and prefects that brought imperial oversight to even the remotest corners of the realm. The emperor's passion for order extended to the economy, where he attempted to halt the devastating inflation that had plagued the 3rd century through the famous Edict on Maximum Prices, a comprehensive catalogue of fixed prices for everything from wheat to silk that revealed both his ambition to control market forces and the ultimate futility of such attempts. Religious policy under Diocletian reflected the complex tensions of an empire in transition, where ancient traditions struggled against emerging faiths. The emperor initially pursued a policy of religious tolerance, understanding that the diverse peoples of the empire required freedom to worship their ancestral gods. However, as his reign progressed and Christian communities continued to expand their influence, particularly within the military and administrative ranks, Diocletian became convinced that this new religion posed a fundamental threat to Roman unity and tradition. The Great Persecution that began in 303 CE represented the last systematic attempt by imperial authority to eradicate Christianity, with churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and believers forced to choose between their faith and their lives. The persecution raged across the empire with varying intensity, yet rather than weakening Christianity, it seemed only to strengthen the resolve of believers and hasten the very transformation Diocletian sought to prevent. The emperor's most extraordinary act came not in war or governance, but in his voluntary abdication in 305 CE, when he stepped down from power and retired to his magnificent palace at Split on the Dalmatian coast. This unprecedented decision reflected Diocletian's understanding that his system required orderly succession to survive, yet it also revealed his weariness with the burdens of rule and his desire to tend the cabbages in his palace gardens. The retirement of such a powerful ruler sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, where emperors typically died in battle, were assassinated, or clung to power until death claimed them. Diocletian's peaceful withdrawal demonstrated that imperial power could be transferred without bloodshed, though the events that followed would prove that his carefully constructed system could not long survive his guiding hand. The collapse of the Tetrarchy unleashed another round of civil wars that raged across the empire for nearly 2 decades, as ambitious generals and imperial relatives struggled for supremacy. From this chaos emerged Constantine, son of the Caesar Constantius Chlorus, whose rise to power would eclipse even Diocletian's achievements in reshaping Roman civilization. The young Constantine possessed the military brilliance of his father, combined with a vision that extended far beyond traditional Roman boundaries, embracing innovations that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations of emperors. His victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 CE against his rival Maxentius became legendary, not merely for its military significance, but for the religious conversion that allegedly preceded it. When Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of the Christian cross, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer," the emperor's embrace of Christianity represented a seismic shift in the religious landscape of the ancient world, transforming a persecuted minority faith into the favored religion of imperial authority. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE officially ended the persecution of Christians and granted them freedom of worship throughout the empire, while Constantine's personal patronage provided the resources necessary for Christianity to flourish. Churches rose from the ruins of pagan temples, bishops found themselves welcomed at imperial court, and Christian symbols adorned the standards of Roman legions. The emperor's conversion was both deeply personal and profoundly political, reflecting his genuine belief in Christian teachings while recognizing the faith's potential to unite the empire under a single religious banner. Constantine's establishment of a new capital at Constantinople represented the culmination of transformations that had been building for generations, creating a new Rome on the shores of the Bosphorus that would serve as the eastern anchor of imperial power. The city rose from the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium with breathtaking speed, adorned with magnificent churches, spacious forums, and grand palaces that proclaimed the glory of Christian empire. This eastern capital embodied the synthesis of Roman administrative genius, Greek cultural refinement, and Christian spiritual authority that would define Byzantine civilization for the next millennium. The foundation of Constantinople also reflected the eastward shift of imperial focus, acknowledging the reality that the wealthiest and most populous provinces lay in Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, rather than in the traditional heartland of Italy. The religious councils convened by Constantine revealed his determination to create doctrinal unity within his newly favored faith, recognizing that theological disputes could prove as divisive as political conflicts. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE brought together bishops from across the Christian world to address the Arian controversy, which threatened to split the Church over fundamental questions about the nature of Christ. The emperor presided over these deliberations with the gravity of a supreme pontiff, understanding that religious unity was essential to the stability of his realm. The Nicene Creed that emerged from these discussions provided a statement of orthodox Christian belief that would endure for centuries, while the precedent of imperial involvement in religious affairs established a pattern that would characterize Byzantine Christianity. The legacy of Diocletian and Constantine extended far beyond their individual reigns, establishing precedents and institutions that would shape the remainder of Roman history. Diocletian's administrative reforms created the bureaucratic framework that would govern the later empire, while his recognition of the need for shared authority acknowledged realities that his predecessors had refused to accept. Constantine's synthesis of Roman imperial power with Christian religious authority created a new model of rulership that influenced medieval kingship throughout Europe and the Byzantine Empire. Together, these emperors bridged the gap between the classical world of pagan antiquity and the Christian civilization of medieval Europe. Their innovations creating the foundation upon which later rulers would build their own interpretations of imperial authority and divine sanction. In the deepening shadows of the 4th and 5th centuries, the Roman Empire moved like an ancient tree whose roots still ran deep, but whose branches had begun to bend under the weight of accumulated seasons. The great marble halls of power, once filled with the confident voices of Augustus and Trajan, now echoed with whispered consultations and hurried footsteps. The purple robes of imperial authority, worn by men whose names would fade into the gentle obscurity of time, seemed somehow heavier now, as if woven with the accumulated gravity of centuries. The emperors of this twilight era ruled over an empire that had grown too vast for any single mind to comprehend. Its borders stretching like gossamer threads across landscapes that seemed to shift and blur in the uncertain light. Diocletian had divided the realm, creating a tetrarchy where 4 rulers shared the impossible burden of governance, each managing their portion of the world with the careful attention of gardeners tending to different sections of an enormous estate. This division, born of pragmatic necessity, marked the beginning of a slow transformation, as the unified vision of empire gradually gave way to more localized concerns and regional identities. The city of Rome itself had begun to feel the weight of its own history, its 7 hills crowned with monuments to gods and emperors who belonged increasingly to memory rather than to the living world. Constantine, that pivotal figure who straddled 2 ages, moved the heart of imperial power eastward to his new city on the Bosphorus, where Byzantine artisans would spend decades crafting a second Rome from marble and gold and ambitious dreams. The old capital continued to function, continued to draw senators to its forum and citizens to its theatres, but something ineffable had shifted, like the moment when afternoon begins its gentle slide toward evening. The barbarian tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube, once held at bay by the disciplined formations of Roman legions, had evolved from scattered warbands into organized confederations with their own internal structures and sophisticated diplomatic traditions. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Saxons moved across the landscape, not merely as destroyers, but as peoples seeking new homes, carrying with them their own laws, languages, and ways of understanding the world. Roman generals increasingly found themselves negotiating rather than conquering, offering land and titles in exchange for military service, weaving these new peoples into the fabric of empire through marriage alliances and shared interests. The army itself had transformed almost beyond recognition from the citizen soldiers who had marched behind Caesar or stood guard along Hadrian's wall. Professional soldiers from distant provinces served alongside Germanic mercenaries whose loyalty was bound more to their immediate commanders than to abstract concepts of Roman glory. The old military traditions persisted in ceremony and regulation, but the reality had become something far more complex and fluid, a military machine that operated according to the immediate needs of survival rather than the grand strategies of conquest. Christianity had woven itself into the very foundations of imperial authority, transforming not only the religious landscape, but the entire conceptual framework through which rulers understood their relationship to power and to their subjects. Bishops sat in councils alongside administrators, their influence extending far beyond matters of doctrine into questions of governance, justice, and the proper ordering of society. The old gods had not vanished entirely, but they had retreated into private worship and philosophical speculation, their temples gradually repurposed, or left to the gentle encroachment of ivy and weather. Economic pressures mounted like storm clouds on a distant horizon, the result of decades of military expenditure, declining agricultural productivity in some regions, and the complex challenges of maintaining trade networks that spanned 3 continents. The gold that had once flowed into Roman coffers from conquered territories now moved more slowly, and imperial administrators found themselves managing resources with the careful precision of householders rather than the expansive confidence of world conquerors. Taxation systems grew more elaborate and burdensome, creating layers of bureaucracy that sometimes seemed to exist primarily to sustain themselves. The emperors of this period ruled with a kind of dignified resignation, maintaining the forms and ceremonies of absolute power while navigating an increasingly complex web of practical limitations. Honorius, ruling from Ravenna, while Alaric's Goths approached the gates of Rome itself, embodied this strange combination of imperial grandeur and tactical flexibility. The sack of Rome in 410 sent shockwaves throughout the civilized world, yet life continued, trade resumed, and the mechanisms of government adapted to these new realities with the persistent efficiency that had always characterized Roman administration. In distant Britain, the legions began their gradual withdrawal, not in defeat, but in response to more pressing needs elsewhere, leaving behind roads, walls, and cities that would endure for centuries as monuments to their presence. Gaul saw the emergence of Germanic kingdoms that maintained Roman legal traditions while establishing their own cultural identities. North Africa witnessed the rise of Vandal power that preserved much of the existing administrative structure while adding new elements drawn from their own tribal heritage. The final Western emperors ruled over territories that had contracted like a slow tide, their authority most secure in Italy itself, while nominal throughout much of what had once been the unified empire. Romulus Augustulus, the last to bear the title, was little more than a child when Germanic chieftain Odoacer pensioned him off to a villa in Campania, sending the imperial regalia eastward to Constantinople, with a message that the West no longer required its own emperor. This transition occurred not with the crash of falling masonry, but with the quiet efficiency of a well-managed administrative transfer. The Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years, maintaining Roman law, Roman administrative traditions, and the continuous thread of imperial succession that stretched back to Augustus. Byzantine emperors would rule from the Golden City on the Bosphorus, their dominions waxing and waning with the centuries, but never entirely losing their connection to the classical world from which they had emerged. The Roman Empire had not ended so much as transformed, adapting to new circumstances while preserving essential elements of its institutional memory. In the monasteries and scriptoriums of the early medieval world, monks carefully copied the works of Roman historians, poets, and philosophers, preserving in their illuminated manuscripts the intellectual heritage of the empire that had shaped their continent. The Latin language continued to serve as the medium of learning and administration, carrying forward Roman legal concepts and governmental practices into societies that would have seemed foreign to Caesar or Augustus, yet remained recognizably heir to their achievements. The slow dissolution of Roman imperial power in the West represented not catastrophe but metamorphosis, the transformation of one form of civilization into another that retained essential characteristics while adapting to changed circumstances. Like twilight gradually giving way to the soft darkness of night, the empire faded not into emptiness, but into a different kind of existence, its influence spreading through law, language, architecture, and the countless quiet ways that institutions shape the societies they leave behind. The Eternal City slept peacefully beside its ancient river, dreaming perhaps of the distant sound of marching legions, while across Europe, the seeds of new civilizations took root in soil enriched by centuries of Roman cultivation.